The sun was setting over the quiet streets of Montgomery, casting a golden glow on the bustling intersections. Officer Ryan Whitman adjusted his patrol hat and leaned back in his seat, eyes scanning the passing cars. He'd worked this beat for years and prided himself on being thorough, always trusting his instincts. Tonight, something caught his eye. A sleek black Mercedes cruising smoothly down the lane. The driver, a black man in a tailored suit, glanced briefly at the patrol car as he passed. Ryan's eyebrows furrowed. To Ryan, the car seemed out of place in this part of town. A feeling, a gut instinct, he would have called it, itched at him. Without hesitation, he flipped on his lights and signaled for the car to pull over. The Mercedes slowed to a stop at the side of the road. Ryan stepped out, his hand instinctively brushing the holster on his belt as he approached the vehicle. The driver rolled down his window, his face calm but clearly puzzled. "Is there a problem, officer?" he asked, his tone even and polite. Ryan stared at him for a moment before replying. "License and registration, please," he said, his voice firm. The man nodded and reached into his glove compartment. As he handed over the documents, Ryan glanced down at the papers, his eyes narrowing. Everything seemed in order, but he couldn't shake the nagging suspicion. "What brings you to this area tonight?" he asked, his tone carrying a subtle edge. "I'm coming back from a meeting," the man replied simply. His voice held no trace of irritation, but his steady gaze met Ryan's with quiet authority. Ryan felt his frustration build. There was something about the man's composed demeanor that unsettled him. He glanced back at the patrol car, noticing his partner, Officer Danny Hayes, watching from inside. Danny had always been quieter, less assertive, and Ryan was used to taking the lead. "Stay here," Ryan ordered, stepping back toward his cruiser. He ran the license and registration through the system, but as expected, nothing came up. No warrants, no violations. Still, the itch of suspicion remained. Behind the wheel of the Mercedes, the driver glanced at his watch, his patience wearing thin. Meanwhile, a bystander across the street began recording on her phone. She'd seen too many situations like this before and wasn't about to let this one go unnoticed. Ryan returned to the driver's side, his face taut. "Step out of the vehicle," he said, his tone sharper now. The man raised an eyebrow, his expression shifting to one of mild incredulity. "Is there a reason for this?" he asked. "It's routine," Ryan replied curtly. The man hesitated but complied, stepping out with an air of calm confidence that seemed to challenge Ryan's authority without a single word. As he stood there, the glow of a street lamp illuminated his face, and for the first time, Ryan noticed the polished shoes, the tailored suit, and the small pin on his lapel. "What exactly are you looking for, officer?" the man asked, his tone measured. His question hung in the air, and for a moment, it felt like time itself had paused. Before Ryan could respond, the sound of tires crunching against the gravel drew everyone's attention. A sleek black SUV pulled up slowly, parking behind the patrol car. Its tinted window rolled down, revealing a woman with her hair neatly tied back, dressed in a sharp navy blue suit. Her piercing gaze landed directly on Ryan. She stepped out of the SUV with an air of authority, her heels clicking purposefully against the asphalt. Ryan straightened instinctively, the weight of her presence almost tangible. She didn't need to introduce herself. The intensity in her demeanor spoke volumes. "What's going on here?" she asked, her voice low and commanding, more like a directive than a question. Ryan opened his mouth to respond but faltered. His partner, Danny, stepped out of the patrol car, his face a mix of confusion and unease. The woman, now standing inches away from the driver of the Mercedes, extended a hand. Her tone softened slightly as she said, "Attorney General Adams." Ryan froze, the words echoing in his head. "Attorney General." His throat tightened as he struggled to comprehend what was unfolding. Mark Adams, the man he had just pulled over and treated with suspicion, was not just another driver. He was the highest-ranking legal officer in the state. Adams shook the woman's hand with a faint smile. "Director Hastings," he said, addressing her formally. "I didn't expect you here so quickly." "I thought this situation warranted my attention," she replied, her gaze shifting back to Ryan. Her expression turned icy, each word she spoke like a blade cutting through the tense night air. Officer Whitman, do you have any idea who you just stopped? Ryan felt his stomach drop, his confidence crumbling under the weight of her words. He glanced at Danny, silently pleading for backup, but his partner looked away, unwilling to meet his eyes. The bystander with the phone moved closer, capturing every word of the unfolding drama. Her camera was steady, her focus sharp, as if she knew this moment would soon ripple far beyond the quiet streets of Montgomery. Director Hastings took a step forward, her voice ringing with authority. Your actions tonight are not just an embarrassment to this department. They are a stain on the justice system itself. She turned to Danny, her gaze softening slightly. Officer Hayes, you witnessed this. Do you have anything to add? Danny hesitated, his hands gripping his notepad tightly. The weight of the moment pressed down on him, the choice between loyalty to his partner and the truth gnawing at his conscience. As the streetlights flickered overhead, Ryan stood frozen, the gravity of his actions sinking in. He had crossed a line that could not be uncrossed. And with every passing second, it became clear that this was only the beginning. Asterisk, what happens next? Will Officer Ryan face the consequences of his actions? And will Danny find the courage to speak out? Or will he remain silent? Stay tuned for the full story, and don't forget to share your thoughts in the comments below. The street felt unnaturally quiet despite the murmurs of passersby who had begun to gather at a distance. The woman with the phone was still recording, her steady hand capturing every tense exchange between Ryan, Director Hastings, and Attorney General Adams. Ryan's pulse quickened as he tried to process the gravity of what was happening. This wasn't just any routine traffic stop, it was turning into something much bigger. Danny shifted uncomfortably beside the patrol car, his face pale and unsure. He had been with the force for only a few years and had always looked up to Ryan. Ryan was decisive, confident, and experienced. But tonight, Danny was seeing another side of him, a side that made him question everything he thought he knew about his partner. He wanted to say something, to intervene, but the words stuck in his throat. Mark Adams, the Attorney General, stood with quiet authority, his presence commanding without him having to raise his voice. There was something about him, his calm composure, his piercing gaze, that made it clear he was no stranger to confrontation. This wasn't the first time he faced someone trying to undermine him, and it likely wouldn't be the last. He fought battles far more complex than this, but the look in his eyes showed that this moment struck a deeper chord. Director Hastings, Mark said, his voice calm but laced with frustration, this situation isn't just about me. It's a reflection of a much larger problem. You and I both know this isn't an isolated incident. Rebecca Hastings, the head of the State Department of Justice, nodded solemnly. You're absolutely right, she said. Her sharp eyes flicked back to Ryan, who was now fidgeting nervously. But tonight, this officer's actions are under the spotlight, and there will be accountability. Ryan felt a cold sweat form on his brow. He wasn't a rookie. He knew the weight of the accusation hanging in the air. Ma'am, he began, his voice cracking slightly. I was just following protocol. I stopped the vehicle because... Because what? Hastings interrupted, her voice cutting through the night like a razor. Because he was driving a nice car. Because he didn't look like someone who belonged in this neighborhood. She crossed her arms, her tone unyielding. That's not protocol, Officer Whitman. That's profiling. The words hit Ryan like a punch to the gut. He wanted to argue, to defend himself, but he knew deep down that his instincts tonight had been guided by something far less noble than protocol. And now, standing in front of the Attorney General and the Director of the State Department of Justice, his excuses felt hollow even to himself. Danny's heart pounded as he watched the scene unfold. He could feel the tension growing thicker with every passing second. He had always believed in the ideals of justice and fairness, the reasons he joined the force in the first place. But now, seeing Ryan's actions and the fallout they were causing, he began to wonder if those ideals had been compromised somewhere along the way. Rebecca Hastings turned her attention to Danny, her gaze softening slightly but still firm. Officer Hayes, she said, her voice steady, you've been quiet. You were here, You saw everything. Do you think this was justified? Danny's stomach churned. All eyes were on him now. Ryan's, Mark's, the woman recording, even the small crowd that had gathered in the shadows. He opened his mouth, but no sound came out at first. He could feel Ryan's gaze burning into him, a silent plea for solidarity. But Hastings' words echoed in his mind. Asterisk silence only perpetuates the problem. Asterisk. Danny hesitated, his voice barely audible. He looked at Ryan, then back at Hastings. I don't think he was doing anything wrong, he finally admitted, his words tumbling out awkwardly. Mr. Adams, I mean. He had all his paperwork. He was cooperative. I don't know why the stop had to escalate. Ryan's face hardened, his jaw clenching. Thanks for the support, Danny, he said bitterly, his voice dripping with sarcasm. Danny flinched but said nothing more. Hastings nodded, her expression unreadable. Thank you for your honesty, Officer Hayes, she said simply. Her focus returned to Ryan. Officer Whitman, this is your moment to own up to your actions. Do you have anything else to say? Ryan's mind raced. He felt cornered, exposed. Everything he had worked for was hanging by a thread, and one wrong move could snap it completely. I thought I was doing my job, he stammered. I made a call based on what I saw. That's what we're trained to do. No, Hastings said sharply. You weren't doing your job. You were acting on bias. And let me be clear, bias has no place in law enforcement. The crowd across the street was growing, the murmurs of onlookers now more audible. Several people had their phones out, recording from different angles. The woman who had been recording from the start shifted slightly to get a better view. She knew the video she was capturing could go viral, and with it, the truth about what had happened here tonight. Mark Adams took a step closer to Ryan, his eyes locked on the officers. Do you have any idea what it feels like, he began, his voice steady but powerful, to be judged before you even open your mouth? To have someone look at you and assume the worst, simply because of the color of your skin. You don't, and that's the problem. Ryan couldn't meet his gaze. For the first time, he felt a flicker of shame creep into his chest. He had spent years believing he was one of the good guys, someone who upheld the law without bias. But tonight had cracked that illusion wide open. As the tension hung in the air, the sound of sirens in the distance grew louder. Hastings glanced toward the approaching vehicles, her expression firm. Internal Affairs is on their way, she said. We'll be reviewing every second of body camera footage, and I expect a full report on my desk by morning. Ryan's heart sank further. This wasn't just a slap on the wrist. It was a full-scale investigation. He looked over at Danny, but his partner's gaze was fixed on the ground. Danny felt a pang of guilt for not standing by Ryan, but another, stronger feeling was growing within him, a sense of relief. Relief that the truth was finally coming to light. As the Internal Affairs vehicles pulled up, the officers inside stepped out with somber expressions. The lead investigator, a tall man with a stern face, approached Hastings and nodded. We're ready to begin, he said. Hastings turned back to Ryan one last time. Officer Whitman, she said, her tone icy, this is far from over. Ryan stood frozen as the investigators began their work, reviewing footage, taking statements, and documenting every detail. The crowd of onlookers continued to grow, their voices now a mix of curiosity and outrage. Mark Adams walked back toward his Mercedes, his steps slow and deliberate. As he opened the door, he paused, turning back to face the scene one last time. His expression was one of quiet determination. He had endured moments like this before, but tonight felt different. Tonight felt like the beginning of something bigger. Rebecca Hastings watched him go, her sharp gaze returning to Ryan and Danny. This isn't just about holding one officer accountable, she said, her voice carrying the weight of her conviction. It's about changing the entire system, and we won't stop until that happens. Ryan's world felt like it was crumbling around him. Danny, still gripping his notepad tightly, realized that tonight would leave a mark on him too, a mark that would shape the decisions he made moving forward. And as the cameras kept rolling, capturing every moment, the world outside Montgomery began to take notice. The air in the precinct was heavy the following morning. News of the incident had spread like wildfire. with clips from the woman's video flooding social media. On every platform, there were debates and hashtags calling for accountability. Ryan Whitman's name was trending, but not in the way he had ever imagined. Meanwhile, Mark Adams sat quietly in his office at the state courthouse, staring out the window, his mind racing with thoughts of what had transpired the night before. Mark had always known the road to justice was long and winding, but something about the previous night reignited a fire within him. He had spent years fighting systemic injustices, working tirelessly to implement policies that would protect those often targeted unfairly, but being profiled himself. That hit differently. It wasn't the first time, but it was a stark reminder of just how far the state still had to go. He turned his chair back toward his desk, where a pile of case files sat waiting. Normally, he would have dived right in, but today was different. He picked up his phone and dialed Rebecca Hastings. When she answered, her voice was crisp but weary, as if the weight of the night hadn't quite left her either. "Rebecca," Mark began, his tone measured but firm, "this isn't just about Officer Whitman. You and I both know this goes deeper than one bad decision." "I agree," Hastings said. "But if we're going to address the roots of this, we need to tread carefully. The system doesn't change overnight, Mark, and you know that as well as I do." "Carefully?" Mark echoed, his voice tinged with frustration. "How many more nights like last night need to happen before we stop treading carefully? This isn't just about changing policies. It's about changing mindsets." Hastings sighed. "I'm with you, Mark. You know I am. But we need to be strategic. The public is watching, and any misstep could set us back even further." Mark knew she was right, but that didn't make it any easier to stomach. As he hung up, he resolved to push harder, to make sure last night wasn't just another blip on the radar of progress. Meanwhile, at the precinct, Danny Hayes sat in the break room, nursing a cup of coffee he didn't even want. The morning briefing had been tense, with whispers about the investigation buzzing in every corner. Ryan had avoided eye contact with everyone, retreating to his desk in silence. Danny couldn't shake the feeling of guilt that had been gnawing at him since the night before. He had spoken up, yes, but it didn't feel like enough. Across the room, Lieutenant Morales, a veteran officer with a reputation for fairness, watched Danny closely. Morales had been on the force long enough to recognize the signs of a young officer wrestling with his conscience. After a moment, he walked over and sat down across from Danny. "You did the right thing, you know," Morales said, his voice low but steady. Danny looked up, his eyes tired. "Did I? Because it feels like I just threw my partner under the bus." "You didn't throw anyone under the bus," Morales replied firmly. "You told the truth, and that takes guts, especially in this line of work." Danny nodded, but the weight in his chest didn't lighten. "It just feels like, if I'd spoken up earlier, maybe none of this would have happened." "Maybe," Morales admitted. "But what matters now is what you do moving forward. The system's broken, Hayes. We all know it. But change starts with people like you, people willing to call it out when they see it." Danny sat in silence, turning Morales' words over in his mind. He had joined the force to make a difference, to help people. But now, he realized that making a difference wasn't always about arresting bad guys or solving crimes. Sometimes it was about holding up a mirror to the institution he was a part of and facing the uncomfortable truths staring back. At the same time, Ryan Whitman sat in a small interrogation room, facing two internal affairs officers. The room was cold and sterile, the walls bare except for a clock ticking ominously above the door. Ryan felt like he was suffocating under their scrutiny. "Officer Whitman," one of the investigators began, "can you walk us through the events leading up to the traffic stop?" Ryan took a deep breath. "I was on patrol with Officer Hayes. We saw a vehicle that seemed out of place, so I decided to initiate a stop." "Out of place?" the investigator pressed, raising an eyebrow. "Can you elaborate on what you mean by that?" Ryan hesitated, his mouth dry. He knew what they were getting at, and he hated how transparent it all seemed now. It was a high-end car in a neighborhood where you don't usually see those kinds of vehicles, he admitted reluctantly. The investigator exchanged a glance with her partner before leaning forward. And that alone was enough to justify pulling the car over. "Did you see any erratic driving? Any signs of illegal activity?" Ryan's jaw tightened. "No," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "I didn't." The weight of his words hung in the air like a dark cloud. For the first time, Ryan was forced to confront the reality of his actions. He had always prided himself on being a good cop, but last night had shown him that good intentions weren't enough. Outside the precinct, the woman who had recorded the incident, a local community activist named Angela Reed, was holding a small press conference. Standing in front of a group of reporters, she spoke passionately about the need for accountability and systemic change. "This isn't just about one officer or one incident," Angela said, her voice steady but filled with emotion. "It's about a pattern, a culture, that allows racial profiling to persist. We can't keep sweeping these issues under the rug and pretending they don't exist. The time for change is now." As her words echoed through the streets and onto countless screens, the ripples of the previous night's events continued to spread. Mark Adams watched the press conference from his office, a small smile tugging at the corner of his lips. Angela's determination reminded him of why he had chosen this path in the first place. But the road ahead was still uncertain. The investigation into Ryan Whitman's actions was just beginning, and the public's demand for justice showed no signs of slowing down. And as the tension continued to build, one thing was clear: this was only the beginning. The pressure surrounding the incident continued to mount as public scrutiny reached a boiling point. Outside the precinct, protesters had doubled in number, their chants growing louder and more unified. Signs bearing slogans like *end racial profiling and *justice for Al* filled the air with urgency. Angela Reed stood at the forefront, organizing the crowd and ensuring their voices were heard. She had become the face of the movement, and her determination to see change was unshakable. Inside the precinct, tension simmered among the officers. Ryan had been placed on administrative leave pending the outcome of the investigation, but his absence didn't ease the strain. Conversations in the break room and hallways were divided. Some defended Ryan, insisting he had just made an unfortunate mistake, while others saw the incident as a wake-up call. Danny Hayes, caught in the middle, felt the growing distance from his colleagues. His decision to speak up had placed an invisible line between him and the others, and the isolation weighed heavily on him. Danny sat at his desk, staring blankly at his computer screen. He had spent the last few days replaying the incident in his mind, dissecting every moment and wondering if he could have done more. A soft knock on his cubicle wall snapped him out of his thoughts. He turned to see Lieutenant Morales, who motioned for him to follow. In the quiet of Morales' office, Danny felt the walls closing in as Morales leaned back in his chair, studying him intently. "I need to ask you something, Hayes," Morales said, his tone neutral but probing. "Do you regret speaking up?" Danny hesitated. The truth was complicated. "I don't regret telling the truth," he finally said, his voice steady despite the conflict brewing inside him. "But I do regret how it's affected everything else. The team, the job. It's not the same anymore." Morales nodded slowly, his expression unreadable. "You're learning something most people in this job never realize," he said after a long pause. "Sometimes, doing what's right means standing alone. But if you let fear or doubt silence you, nothing changes." Danny's chest tightened at the weight of Morales' words. He nodded, unsure of how to respond, but grateful for the rare moment of guidance. As he left the office, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was standing at a crossroads, and every choice carried consequences. Meanwhile, Mark Adams was preparing for another press conference. The backlash from the incident had sparked conversations across the state, and he was determined to keep the momentum going. In the days following the traffic stop, he had received countless messages from people sharing their own experiences with racial profiling. Their stories fueled his resolve, and he knew the upcoming address would be crucial in setting the tone for what came next. As Mark adjusted his tie in the mirror, Rebecca Hastings entered the room, her presence commanding as always. "You ready for this?" she asked, her sharp eyes scanning him for any signs of doubt. Mark met her gaze, his expression firm. "I've been ready for this my whole life," he said, the conviction in his voice unmistakable. The press conference was held in front of the courthouse, with a sea of reporters and cameras waiting to capture every word. Mark stepped up to the podium, the hum of anticipation palpable. He began by recounting the events of that night, not as a victim, but as a witness to a systemic issue that needed to be addressed. His words were deliberate, each one carrying the weight of countless experiences like his own. "This isn't just about me," he said, his voice strong but measured. "It's about a system that has failed to protect the very people it was meant to serve. It's about accountability, fairness, and the responsibility we all share to create a justice system that truly upholds its name." The crowd erupted in applause, their energy electrifying. But as Mark continued, he couldn't ignore the storm brewing behind the scenes. Ryan Whitman had been uncharacteristically quiet since the incident, but his silence didn't mean he wasn't preparing a defense. Mark knew the investigation could take unexpected turns, and he braced himself for whatever might come next. In a small house on the outskirts of the city, Ryan sat at his kitchen table, staring at a pile of paperwork and legal documents. His lawyer, an older man with a stern demeanor, was reviewing the case with a critical eye. Ryan felt like a stranger in his own skin, the confidence that once defined him now replaced with uncertainty and regret. "You got to own up to your actions, Ryan," the lawyer said, his tone blunt but not unkind. "If you try to spin this, it'll only backfire. The evidence is clear. What matters now is how you handle it." Ryan nodded, his throat tight. He wanted to defend himself, to explain that he wasn't a bad person, just someone who made a mistake, but he knew that words alone wouldn't undo the damage. He had to face the consequences, whatever they might be. Back at the precinct, the internal affairs investigation was nearing its climax. Rebecca Hastings had made it clear that transparency was non-negotiable, and the body camera footage had been released to the public. The video, paired with Angela Reed's original recording, painted a damning picture of Ryan's actions that night. The public outcry only intensified, with calls for systemic reform growing louder. Danny watched the fallout unfold from the sidelines, his emotions a tangled mess of guilt, anger, and determination. He knew the situation was bigger than Ryan or himself. It was a reflection of the system they operated within. And as much as he wanted to believe in the integrity of the badge he wore, he couldn't ignore the cracks that had been exposed. One evening, as he sat alone in his car outside the precinct, his phone buzzed with a notification. It was a message from Angela Reed, thanking him for speaking up during the incident. Her words were simple but powerful, and they reignited a sense of purpose he thought he had lost. "You did the right thing," the message read, "and because of that, people are finally paying attention." Danny stared at the screen, his mind racing. For the first time in days, he felt a glimmer of hope. Maybe, just maybe, his actions could help push the needle toward real change. But the road ahead was still uncertain, and the weight of what was to come loomed large over everyone involved. The climax of this story was fast approaching, and no one could predict how it would end. Danny sat in his car, staring at Angela Reed's message. The words were meant to reassure him, but they stirred a conflict he couldn't shake. He'd done the right thing, hadn't he? Yet every time he stepped into the precinct, the weight of silent judgment from his colleagues reminded him that the line between loyalty and justice wasn't just blurry. It was razor thin. Still, the thought of Angela's message lingered, a faint but steady reminder that his actions were part of something bigger than himself. Inside the precinct, the mood had shifted dramatically. The body camera footage had painted an unflattering picture of Ryan Whitman, but it also revealed something unexpected: Danny's hesitation. In the video, there was a brief, unspoken moment when Ryan had looked to him for support, and Danny had faltered. That hesitation was now being dissected by internal affairs and whispered about in the precinct. It wasn't just Ryan on trial anymore. Danny's own role was under quiet but intense scrutiny. Ryan, for his part, wasn't going down quietly. During his interview with Internal Affairs, he made a surprising claim that Danny had initially supported his actions during the stop. It wasn't entirely true, but it wasn't entirely false either. Ryan's words added a new layer of complexity to the investigation, pulling Danny deeper into the storm. When Danny heard about Ryan's statement, his stomach dropped. Was this Ryan's way of saving himself, Or was it a desperate attempt to share the blame? Either way, it was a betrayal he hadn't seen coming. As Danny wrestled with this new development, Rebecca Hastings was hard at work, ensuring the investigation moved swiftly and transparently. But even Hastings wasn't immune to the complications of the case. Late one night, she received an anonymous tip that suggested the traffic stop wasn't as random as it seemed. According to the tip, Ryan may have been tipped off about the Attorney General's car by someone higher up in the department. If true, this revelation would blow the case wide open, implicating not just Ryan, but the very institution Hastings was trying to hold accountable. Hastings sat in her office, the tip weighing heavily on her mind. She couldn't ignore it, but acting on it meant diving into dangerous territory. If there was a conspiracy at play, it could threaten the credibility of the entire department. Still, Hastings knew she had no choice. The truth, no matter how inconvenient, had to come out. She ordered her team to dig deeper into Ryan's actions leading up to the stop, including his communications and any potential connections to higher-ranking officials. Meanwhile, Mark Adams was preparing for his next move. The protests had gained national attention, and he was using the momentum to push for a broader conversation about systemic reform. But as Mark stood on the steps of the courthouse, addressing a growing crowd of supporters, he received a call that stopped him in his tracks. It was Hastings, and her tone was grim. "We've uncovered something that changes everything," she said, her voice steady but laced with urgency. "There's a possibility that Ryan wasn't acting alone." Mark's grip tightened on his phone as he processed her words. "Are you saying this was planned?" he asked, his voice low to avoid being overheard. "We don't have all the answers yet," Hastings admitted. "But if what we're finding is true, this isn't just about racial profiling. It's about corruption at the highest levels." Mark's mind raced as he considered the implications. The fight for justice was already an uphill battle. But if Hastings was right, the stakes were higher than anyone had anticipated. He ended the call with a promise to stay informed and return to the crowd, his focus sharper than ever. This wasn't just a personal fight anymore. It was a battle for the soul of the justice system itself. Back at the precinct, Danny found himself pulled into another meeting with Internal Affairs. This time, the questions were sharper, the tone more probing. The investigators wanted to know about his relationship with Ryan, about their conversations leading up to the incident, and about that critical moment during the stop when he hesitated. Danny answered as honestly as he could, but the pressure was relentless. Every answer felt like walking a tightrope, with the abyss of guilt and blame yawning beneath him. After the meeting, Danny sat alone in the break room, his head in his hands. He felt like a pawn in a game he didn't understand, caught between forces far beyond his control. Just as he was about to leave, Angela Reed walked in. She had been invited to the precinct to meet with Hastings, but seeing Danny, she paused. "You okay?" she asked, her tone soft but concerned. Danny looked up, surprised by her presence. He hesitated before answering. "I don't know," he admitted. "It feels like everything's spiraling out of control." Angela nodded, pulling out a chair to sit across from him. "It's always messy before it gets better," she said. "But you did the right thing, Danny, and that matters." Her words offered a small measure of comfort, but Danny knew the road ahead was still uncertain. As Angela stood to leave, she turned back to him. "Just remember," she said, her voice firm. "The truth has a way of coming out, no matter how hard people try to bury it." Her words lingered long after she left, a reminder that the fight for justice was far from over. But as Danny walked out of the break room, he couldn't shake the feeling that the storm was only beginning to gather. Somewhere in the shadows of the department, secrets were being uncovered, and when they came to light, they would change everything.